this. I see Brian and Brett and Doug and Evan and Bill, and apparently Tanya's not able to join us then, is that right?
Yeah, I don't believe that she RSVP'd, so.
Okay, great. Let's dive in. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second subgroup meeting of Legislation and Authority subgroup. Nice to have everyone here with us today. Fortunately, we've got a little bit more time. We can take a deep breath here and do a much deeper dive on some of these recommendations and have some good conversation and discussion about the recommendations and how they'll need to evolve. I'd also like to welcome, it looks like Amy Lowndes from DEQ as well as Luke are on the call. Thank you for being with us today. We'll certainly need to rely on our technical experts to help with today's conversation. So thanks for being with us. Just quickly, again, the purpose of the meeting is to just keep moving through the recommendations from the ASDSO report. I thought I'd quickly recap the discussion from subgroup meeting 1, where we landed and where we'll pick up. And then just talk, once we get through the discussion today, talk about next steps and hopefully leave a little bit of time for the subgroup members to identify any issues, anything they've been thinking about, to make sure we capture it for either yet today's discussion or the next one on November 20th. So with that, let me just pause for a minute. Are there any initial questions or comments or anything for the good of the order here?
Yeah. Hey, Mark, this is Douglas. First of all, I apologize I wasn't able to fully participate last time. I was returning from a vacation and driving an RV that in the wind, so it was not propitious. Anyway, I'm a little concerned about an approach that centers on the to this group in particular, that centers on the ASDSO report. I do not want to ignore their recommendations, but I think there's a need for us to get a sort of regulatory architecture in mind in which to slot those recommendations. And so I don't want to throw the meeting off of plan here, but sort of starting from those recommendations and going up is something I'm not real thrilled about, as opposed to us having some conversation about the big picture of what the regulatory system should look like and then going to that. So I'll leave it to those of you who've been involved in organizing this meeting to deal with that comment, and if it's just impractical, you know, go the way you had proposed, but that's my concern.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, for bringing that to our attention. In fact, I mean, it's an excellent observation you make, and actually one of the challenges for us, PSC's team, while the ASDSO provides a great foundation to build from, it kind of boxes us in a little bit in focusing on those recommendations. And so that's the challenge for us. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to. You know, Michigan's obviously different than all the other states. This is a peer review document that could really be overlaid on probably most of the dam safety programs. So, you know, we'll keep that in mind, Doug. And I think for today's discussion, let's at least focus on these recommendations and think about how we want to respond to that in more detail, and maybe hear from the other subgroup members, Doug, just to make sure that we're capturing at least the spirit of what you're suggesting here. I see Tanya's joined the call too. Thank you, Tanya, for being here today.
Well, let me jump in. I think we can, Douglas, I think we can get to where you want to be if we raise those other concerns in the context of the recommendations that are made by ASDSO. As you know, examples, when we get to the Mark sent out the definitions of the high hazard, you know, moderate hazard, low hazard. We need to talk about that and how we structure a regulatory program that as you're suggesting, that deals with everything. The other issue, again, in terms of what Douglas just raised, we are not that report doesn't focus as much as I would have hoped it would on dam removal. To me, dam removal ought to be a first step if you've got a dam that is no longer serving a real useful purpose. So, I want to raise those kind of questions as we move forward.
Yeah. I'll just make a quick.
Oh, you want to go, Evan? You can go first.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I mean, I think it's fair game, Doug, to write down a bullet point at some point. We probably can't tackle them today, kind of to Mark's point, but I think the goal has been to add on. And I expressed to Amy earlier today that what I'm feeling is it's hard for some of us to work on what's already on the list when we really want to add something on. I'd like to know that there's a placeholder there, and I'm fine with waiting 10 months to get to it if I just know it's on there. So it might be helpful to jot those down and send them in. I've got a couple in particular on land use that I would jot down, but I don't plan to bring up today just because I think it gets us off track with what we've got. So that might be one way to do it. I mean, the worst is people say, yeah, I don't think we need to regulate that or add that into the framework. I do hear what you're saying, Doug, about having a framework though, and even just having some additional specific recommendations from people that are over and above what's here might also help us, let's say, build that little tree of like, oh yeah, that's its own branch. That thing that really doesn't fit underneath something like Bill was suggesting. So that's all I have.
So I'll do 30, 45 seconds here and then, let us go back to the plan. But, I think the overarching problem here is that we do not have a system that causes a dam owner to be financially prepared to meet their responsibilities throughout the life cycle of the dam. And that's the framework that for me is missing. The dam safety program, is about inspecting and telling them to do stuff, as opposed to making sure that they have the means to do the stuff they need to do. And I would include in that retirement, maintenance, contributing as they should to emergency preparedness, and being prepared for whatever liabilities they have in the event of a dam washout or other event. And so I'm wanting to create that architecture out of our recommendations, and then plug dam safety program work into that architecture. Right. So if you're going to say they should carry insurance on their liability for damages, we can say the dam safety program should periodically determine the amount of that insurance and talk about how to do that. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to get at. So.
Great, thank you, Doug. Amy, were you going to add something?
So I think the ASDSO report does a good job of comparing us to sort of that national standard and comparing us to other states. And I think in some ways going through the exercise of all the things they thought were missing in our program can give us all kind of the background of the status of our program. And I'm hoping we can use that to jump off into some of the discussions, Doug, that you want to have. Once we're all kind of familiar with where we're at, what does our program do now? How does it look compared to other states? So I think even though we do want to talk big picture and add our own things to their recommendation, I do think it does give us a good jumping off point. So I'm hoping, I don't know if that makes you feel any better, but I think it is helpful to at least figure out where we at.
Yeah, I certainly don't mind that conversation as long as we have an understanding that we're going to devote adequate time to really talking about a regulatory structure.
Okay, that's great.
Real quick, I just wanted to put out there a question more than anything. I expect that most of you folks have seen this, but wondering how this might fit into our conversation. So I received this executive summary, a U.S. Hydropower Climate Solution Conservation Challenge, where a development of a joint statement of collaboration on U.S. hydropower is being developed, or what has been developed over the past 2.5 years. And then they're looking to move it forward over the next 60 days. Gone through it a couple of times and just trying to figure out how this may or may not fit into our conversation, our work. You know, obviously it covers a lot of these same issues and then broader as well. So I didn't know if that was something that was planned on, or folks were aware of, and then how it might fit.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that report you cite, Brett. I don't know if others are, but why don't we acknowledge that at this point in time, keep it in mind. Was there anything specific or this group related to that, or just sort of kind of related to Doug's bigger picture?
Yeah, nothing specific at the moment, but there are a lot of points, you know, of crossover and you know, similar issues that we're dealing with. So.
And was this a federal government? I assume this is federal government or what?
So I received it from the Michigan Hydro Relicensing Coalition.
I saw that same document, Brett.
Okay.
I can share some information
Okay.
about that. I felt like it was outside of even the framework that, you know, Doug, Bill, and others have suggested. On the other hand, I saw another document from those folks that I just haven't been able to circulate to everybody. And I just sent it to Mark here 10 minutes ago because I thought it did have value on what other states are doing with their removal programs. That'll get into our legislative hopper soon, but I didn't want to dominate time on a new topic here, knowing that Mark's under the gun.
Likewise. Likewise. Thank you, Evan. And that's all I wanted to do is just put it out there, see if what awareness was out there and how it may fit, because you know, others are going to understand it better. So, all right, thank you, Evan.
Yep, I'll circle back with Brett.
Great, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the introductory comments here, very helpful. I also want to acknowledge the very capable Aaron Lammers from PSC is with us today, helping me make this as successful as it can be. Thank you, Aaron. Kind of a
despite the rest of us.
So with that, Aaron, why don't we go ahead and pull up the tracking sheet, and we'll start from the top here. Just wanted to provide, again, a brief update on those recommendations that we covered at the first meeting. As you may recall, there were several questions, a couple of requests for information. What this document you're looking at does not or includes that yours does not, that I sent out yesterday, is we did get good input from Eagle on responses to those questions that were identified by the work group. So just to quickly highlight where we left off, of course, the first one there, we inserted the word limited liability. There was general consensus that makes sense. Again, the devil's in the details, and Eagle folks, we're going to inquire with ASDSO and look for some specific language examples. Luke, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to add there. Otherwise, I think, you know, we can just sort of park that one and keep moving.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yep. Any quick comments or questions from others on this? Okay, good. Hearing none. The next one, requiring permits for existing unpermitted dams. You may recall there's a distinction to be made between those that are regulated under 307 versus 315. And there was some discussion about a need to split this recommendation based on, you know, what the universe of those two sets of dams look like. You can see there, there's some detailed numbers on the number of those regulated dams by Eagle, and quickly get to the conclusion that that's about what? About half, maybe a little less than half of at least the low head barrier dams in the state, Luke, that are actually regulated by Eagle. Again, I'd turn to you to see if there's anything you want to fill in there and help with the discussion here.
Sure. So I think you're right. You know, of the 2,600 plus or minus that are in the inventory, only about 1,100 are regulated by the state. And we have data, it looks to be about 25-30% of those. We have specific data on whether or not we approve the construction of that dam. The rest were blank, which would require, I could probably do some filtering and get the ones that before we had the authority to approve. All of those would be a no, obviously. But the remaining dams that were built since the late 70s on, which probably isn't a huge fraction, I would have to probably dig back into the paper files to see if we permitted that or not. So I think it's safe to say, though, you know, probably I'm going to guess more than half of the dams were not permitted at the time of construction by the department, and anything not permitted by the department before 1990, where we had regulatory teeth to require certain safety standards, would probably require that reevaluation component. So it's a good chunk of the dams out there that had little or no, construction review by the department.
Okay, thank you. And I can't help go back to Bill's original comment about dam removal, right? I mean, that seems like sort of a threshold question if we're going to be talking about this, going back to those dams without permits. Obviously dam removal seems like it would need to be part of that conversation, going into it.
Yeah,
Hey,
I noted in the piece that I just finished reading it's a study that looks at other states. It points out that in some states, dam removal is the first thing mentioned to a dam owner. It's as an option in terms of where they head forward in the future, and that to me seems to make enormous sense.
Yeah, this is Douglas. I'd like to propose a change in language. Permit, as it has been used, has been really a permit to construct. And I think what we need, especially for any dams that impinge on the public trust, but generally, is a license of finite term. And so the idea would be that, it's a license to have a dam in the state, and at the expiration or termination of that license, the dam needs to go away or be relicensed. And I think we could do that in a way that anticipates our FERC discussion, next general meeting, but we could essentially deem that a license issued by FERC is a license issued by the state. We could have some conditions that apply to all licensees, that the state would administer if we wanted to, while still allowing, FERC to do the heavy work on those hydropower licenses. And my view is really driven by a couple of things. One is, I don't think the state can, in fact, allow an impingement on the public trust permanently. It should be finite as a matter of, view of public trust law. But more importantly, these are not geological features. Climate changes, dams deteriorate at some point. It's not a question of maintenance. Land use around the dam changes. It's a question of, should that dam be allowed to continue to exist? And I think periodically that burden should be on the dam owner. So the way I would approach it is, say we're going to license new dams for 50 years. Those that exist now, we're going to grandfather at least, say, 10 years or something, or 50 years of life. We can just debate all those numbers, but sort of set up where pretty promptly everybody gets a license or is forced to deal with dam removal, and then systematically from there on, licenses get renewed on a schedule.
Okay. Comments from others on that point by Douglas?
I think Douglas, I don't yeah.
I said a lot.
No, but the problem with the way we've treated these dams is, as Douglas pointed out, it's a permit to construct, and there's not a periodic review. The only time, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only time it gets reviewed is when there's an application to fix a dam, do some maintenance, right?
That's correct.
So what, and I don't understand, that doesn't make any sense to me when you have a flowing body of water. Why we don't have a license or a permit that ends at a particular point in time, just as we do in wastewater treatment, just as we do in drinking water, these things all have to be renewed. And I don't understand why in this circumstance, we don't renew.
I think these are really good comments. I just want to throw out, just for perspective, I think we have some very well segregated teams right now, because I heard the polar opposite discussions this morning in the permitting subgroup. So a very different subgroup. So I think it'll be really good to see the larger task force discussion on this specific matter.
Well, why don't we make note of that so that we make sure that the issue gets raised, Mark? That would be good.
Yes, indeed. Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, Mark. I was just going to say that I had been thinking something similar. I support that, but I was just thinking about it from the numbers that Lucas provided, that really owning a responsibility and understanding a responsibility from a state perspective pretty much has to start with understanding the scope of it. And if we have this many dams that either are fall into 315 or fall under 315, that we really don't have some kind of a informational relationship with the owners, it seems like that is still going to leave us ignoring an infrastructure problem across the landscape. So I think what Doug suggested hits and solves a lot of other things. I had just thought from the understanding our dams better and their dam owners, the condition of them, I thought from a very least perspective, kind of a registration type of a concept, so that you actually, know more of those dams, have more of them in databases, and have a way to communicate with the owners. But I think what Doug provided accomplishes that, and quite a few other purposes.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Others, Brett, Tanya, Evan, any comments on this?
I just put a comment in the chat box. I'm generally in agreement there, and appreciate that if another committee's got it wrong, we'll argue with them in a big group.
Yeah.
I'll just say, I think that makes sense too. Sorry, I have yelling kids around here. So.
Yeah, and I would agree. It makes sense. In fact, as it was articulated, much better than I could. This was on my mind in our last session. I just couldn't, lay it out in a way as well as Bill and Brian have done. So yeah, it's this idea of registering these dams so that we understand better what the who the folks are, what the status is, and while being cognizant that if or when they come into some sort of a regulatory framework compliance, that they don't panic and just kind of throw up their hands, and then this infrastructure gets sold for $1, and the liability, the rest of the story. So
okay,
yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Brett. So you can see that Aaron's been tracking some of the language changes there in red. And that looks great, Aaron. I guess I'm just trying to think from a process standpoint here and to keep things moving. you know, she's made the changes that we've discussed here. Is it adequate the way it is written? Then you're all comfortable and we'll continue on. I'm not sure if there's any outstanding questions. We got sort of the numbers answered here.
Yeah, the one thing that I said that I think needs to be added here to carry forward is that we should license all dams, but deem a FERC license to be a licensor by the state of Michigan.
Do we have to FOIA it to get proof of that, though?
Well, that's where we're going to want to add some specifics a little later on. But
yeah,
I
totally agree with conceptually having a placeholder there, and I think the how on all of this is what we have to be careful not to get into, or Mark's going to get in big trouble.
Yeah. Wait. So just so I catch it, it's also deem a FERC license to be a state light.
Yeah. Go ahead. That was my question too.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is, let's assume we're creating a licensing scheme. So we have these licenses, issued by the state of Michigan. And then there are responsibilities that a dam owner has as a result of having a license. And what I'm saying is, I'm not proposing to go to the dual regulation like they have in California, but we want to retain the state's authority over the dam. So if we essentially delegate to FERC the ability to issue a license that we recognize, we can still impose conditions on that licensee, like filing certain reports to the state, without the state undertaking to issue the license, to review the reports, to take action on dam safety. All of those things can still be delegated to FERC. And we're going to want to have some detailed discussions about what should be delegated and what should be an ongoing responsibility of the dam owner to the state of Michigan in light of what has happened. But that's the kind of setup that I'm trying to get at.
Okay. In addition to the state's involvement with a FERC licensed project, right?
Yes, through the normal FERC licensing process. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Douglas and Mark, maybe helps too. In our conversations with ASTSO, it sounded like some other states might be following that model that Douglas just described, where they don't necessarily take over regulatory authority over the dam, but are part of the puzzle where they are receiving all the information related to the dam. And, so there might be examples we can draw from that kind of fit that bill. So I can look into that and maybe get us some examples when we go into the next step of talking about the how. We might have some examples to pull from.
That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Luke, because I was just about to turn to you and see if you had anything else to offer. So very helpful. Okay. Any final thoughts on this second recommendation at this point in time? Bill?
Just a quick question, just so I got it in my head. Douglas, a typical FERC license is for how long?
50 years.
Okay. So, so we're not creating anything different than what the federal government has done through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. If we go to a license, we're doing the same thing that the federal government does. It's not as if it's a brand new idea.
Right. Theirs is for hydropower. We would do it for all dams and then sort of delegate the hydropower dams to them.
Exactly. Simple way to.
And, Bill, the only thing I would add is that in reality, the way I think about those 40, 50-year lifespans of FERC is that they're probably typically longer than you would want or really need to give to a small dam. I think one of the reasons FERC grants such a long one is that they're generating power on those size dams usually comes with a significant investment, and the owners want some assurance of a long time horizon to recover those. Right. And so if we started doing kind of a license process across the board, we may want to think about a tiered approach for ones that do, need a lot of investment. But for a small one, you wouldn't really need to do like a 50-year, because you might not be asking the owner to do anything really different at that time.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Let's keep moving here. On to the next one. The recommendation is to require owners to maintain dam operation monitoring and maintenance records. And there was some discussion about really what's the purpose of this and who'd regularly be reviewing these documents. You can see Eagle's response there. The DSP folks ostensibly would be doing, performing that review. And those are the types of things that they would be looking at. Luke, anything you want to add to that before I open it up for a little more conversation?
Sure. I think this recommendation was based on what the federal agencies do. They require a certain amount of record keeping by the dam owners, then that gets reviewed. So, if we're doing 3, 4, or 5 years in between engineering inspections and they're basically a visual inspection, there's a lot of things that have happened in between those that don't really get reported to the state because we don't have any way to require it other than our broad authority under 315 to require additional analyses and stuff like that. So I think this would just be a way to memorialize that the dam owner should be keeping a certain level of records and providing those to not only our program, but to their consultant so that we get the full picture of everything that happens in between the inspection dates. But that's, so that's kind of what I tried to capture there.
Yeah, thank you. Comments, reactions?
Yeah, this is Douglas. Let me just flag that we should ask the people that are talking about emergency response plans if there are any of these records that they should be receiving on a regular basis or have access to for their purposes.
So just sort of a complementary benefit of a reporting requirement, Doug, that it reaches those that could benefit having that information.
Right.
Okay. Comments from others? Clearly, I guess I don't anticipate really any opposition to this. Luke, the way it's written, the recommendation itself seems to set well with you guys. Is that true?
Yeah, it's a recommendation that we make in every inspection report that we do is, you should be keeping records and you should be having O&M plans that should be reviewed and updated, but we don't really have any teeth to force it. So it's hit or miss whether or not it happens. So yeah, obviously this is one of the things where, more data is good, right? So if the owner can provide us with whatever they have, whether it's inconsequential or if it has some, some information in there that's useful, I think it's a good exercise to do. And if we had some way to require it, that would be beneficial.
Okay.
Let me just point out that if you went to a licensing system, as opposed to the one-time permit system, there's an incentive for the operator to keep those records if he's thinking of renewing his license.
Sure.
Yeah, that does seem to be a good point in the thread. I don't have a suggestion to solve it now, but since we are in the regulatory and legislative group, we probably do need to think about those teeth and what those would look like, because ultimately for requesting this to be codified, we would obviously want the consequence to be codified as well. I don't have a suggestion, but put that on the parking lot, maybe.
My guess is that we're going to want to have conditions of a license and some sort of progressive discipline approach to enforcing those conditions. And it would look something like that.
Okay. Anyone else? Comments, thoughts, questions on this recommendation? Okay, let's keep moving. On to the next one. This is where we had the discussion about high and significant hazard dams and financial responsibility, and make sure that funding is available to the dam safety program to mitigate any hazards presented should the owner fail to do so. And then there was some question again about, the definition of high significant dam rankings that was provided. Let me just pause for a minute. Luke, is there anything you wanted to add here, and then we'll open it up?
Just a brief statement. I think that you like what Dan had said earlier is that there's a lot of crossover between the groups, right? And I think this plays into the bigger picture of how do we ensure that there's money to do things at dams when something bad happens, right? Or something bad could happen. So I think this is kind of one of those that needs to be unsiloed a little bit as we talk about emergency funds for the dam safety program and funding strategies for the dam owners themselves. You know, if this is requiring them to have, you know, some type of financial assurance or some type of insurance policy or whatever that looks like, I think it needs to be part of that larger conversation of how do we do a better job of making sure that crises are averted ahead of time, either if the state has to take action or by allowing dam owners to have the resources that they need to maintain these dams. That's it though.
I know, and I think this came up from Bill at the last meeting regarding the actual definition of these rankings or ratings. And it seems to be focused mostly on public safety and property and not natural resource, the potential for natural resource damage. And I think we use the example of the old, was it the Song of the Morning Dam on the Pine River that blew out, you know, several times over the years, wiped out a trout fishery and those kinds of things.
Sure. So I think there are provisions in Part 315, and I don't know if you want to click, whoever's got control of the spreadsheet, those blue things are buttons. It should take you right to definition or the part of the statute that defines high and significant hazard. And there are provisions for natural resource damages, and we have several dams around the state that are high hazard, not because of the impacts to public safety, where those would be relatively minor, but only because of the environmental degradation that would happen if the dam were to fail. So right there, I think that's significant hazard potential. And see the last one where environmental degradation may be significant. So, I mean, it's included in the definition of when we assign a hazard potential to a dam. You know, if the environmental degradation is the only thing, it still can be a significant or high hazard dam. But you're right. You know, there are provisions in 315 where we can step in and take action or order the owner to take action if the impact is environmental degradation as a result of the existence, operation, failure, et cetera, of a dam. You know, we have some teeth, but so I guess I would encourage you folks to read through those sections of the statute maybe and think about whether they need to be expanded or if we think we have enough authority already. You know, I like I said, I think that 315 gives us the authority. It's a broad authority. We can address these issues, but maybe it needs more of a finer point put on them, you know, like, and then maybe it's an internal procedure or policy or staffing levels that allow us to go after that stuff, you know, more frequently than we do now, something like that.
Great. Thank you, Luke. That's very helpful. Bill?
Yeah, I was going to point out that I know that, you know, if you read the difference between high hazard and medium hazard or whatever it is, it's exactly the same language. So I can't tell where a significant natural resource degradation goes. Is it a high hazard or a medium hazard?
You're right. A lot of this language is very, very similar, and I think there's a great deal of subjectivity in making that determination, and that falls to the department. So maybe that's your recommendation, is we put a finer point on those thresholds, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. How often do those classifications get revisited, and what is the process as a typical? And I'm not asking to be, you know, too pointed, but is it a kind of a multi-department effort where, you know, fish division folks are consulted, water resources with dam safety, or is it more narrow than that? How often does that happen, and what's the process look like in a nutshell?
Sure. So it's a requirement in the rules for inspection reports. So each time an inspection report is completed, there's supposed to be an analysis of whether or not the current hazard potential is sufficient. And we had a conversation about this earlier this morning, and it was basically centered around what we call hazard creep, which would be people moving into the area downstream of the dam, not so much, you know, a new environmental issue or pollution is discovered in the impoundment, but that probably should be part of the conversation, right? Is all things that are listed in what defines a hazard potential should be considered at some level each time the dam is reassessed, and because that stuff can change over time. So I think maybe that's where we start to flesh these out and include that in, expand on maybe what in the inspection reports needs to be evaluated. And so ultimately it's the department's determination of the hazard potential, but the way it's currently set up is that the dam owner and their consultant have to provide the information to us in order for us to be able to make that determination, whether these threats to those things that are bulleted out there exist and at what level, and that determines the hazard potential classification of the dam.
Do you guys back to the other little part of Brian's question here, do you guys regularly check with the Fish Division of DNR? I mean, as these things move forward, do they have the regular opportunity to weigh in?
No, they wouldn't typically be copied on that stuff. So it would be up to us to pull them in if you know, if it was a DNR related concern, you know. So I'm trying to think, you know, which one of those, as they're defined currently, which one of those requires DNR input. You know, if it's you know, pollution, that's usually in Eagle. If it's, you know, downstream impact related to public safety, that's usually Eagle. You know, if we're natural resources, if you're talking to like fish communities and things like that.
Stream, right? Trout stream, Blue Ribbon Trout Stream.
If you're talking about Song of the Morning, definitely DNR was consulted on that one. So
yeah,
for years and years and years. So yeah,
years and years and years ago. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's, you know, I don't think it's not inherently in the statute or rules, but obviously if there's a issue that requires subject matter expertise from DNR, we're going to consult with them, you know, to provide input on what they think the hazard level is.
Yeah, this is Douglas. Just a narrow comment on that. I think it should include all of the public trust aspects of the river. So navigation, you know, whatever else.
Recreation.
Yeah.
I was thinking something along the same lines as Doug, just the word impacts, you know, safe operation and maintenance is one thing, but impacts is another. And I like Doug's reference of some specific.
Yeah. And then not to go down the rabbit hole, but I'd just like to flag that I would like us to discuss another recommendation, which would be this notion that there must be liability insurance for damages, and that the coverage provided by that insurance would be determined from time to time by the dam safety program.
Yeah. So there were really two things going on with this recommendation. I mean, to Doug's point, I mean, actual proof of financial responsibility when that happens, but then we kind of devolved in the actual definition of significant high hazard language. So just to make sure we capture what we need to going forward, I heard a couple of things. It sounds like there's an opportunity to revisit the current language of those hazard rankings for some updates. And then to Doug's point, which is kind of building on this, or a separate recommendation that, you know, adequate proof exists and the amount of that coverage is determined, you know, through the DSP.
Yeah, which is going to relate to the hazard rankings. So,
right.
But the core recommendation here, though, is, as I read it, make sure I'm understanding, is financial responsibility for maintaining and operating the dam, which is separate from this liability question.
Yeah, and clearly FRRs are not, you know, are not, you know, unique to the environmental realm, right? I mean, they're quite common. Whatever acronym, financial responsibility requirements, or there's several others, but it's achieves the same ends here. So, and others comments?
Yes, this is Dan Devon. The one thing I wanted to comment about on the language for the hazard ratings or hazard classifications. And Luke, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, the language that we have for the hazard classifications, low, significant, and high, are from, you know, standard language that's nationally accepted for the hazard classification. And while I'll admit, you know, whether it's significant or high, you know, both of them characterize environmental impacts as, you know, just significant environmental degradation. All of the rest of the characterizations are really pretty specific to a probability and a type of infrastructure, or I say probability of human impact. So that, it's a high hazard, identifies even, or basically just says damage to, or serious damage to inhabited homes, and main highways, class 1 carrier railroads, things like that. And danger to individuals, including potential loss of life, where significant, it's isolated inhabited homes, secondary highways, short line railroads, and then just simply danger to an individual exists. So there are some very discrete and important differences in those definitions. But then furthermore, like I said, I do want to make sure we're a little cognizant of the fact that if we go and change those, not that we can't, but we potentially could be deviating from, nationally accepted standards of those definitions.
This is Douglas. I think perhaps what we're really saying is those definitions don't line up with what's in statute in Michigan. And we ought to think about reconciling them. And that can mean change the statute to use those definitions.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Luke, yeah.
I was just going to say that our definitions do differ slightly from what the Model Dam Safety Program puts forth and what other federal agencies have adopted. And I think that's been kind of a point of consideration for a while, is should we do exactly what Douglas said and make them more in line with the federal, or what's the benefit, or do we need to expand on the federal to fit Michigan's needs? So I think that's all. I think we don't think we have to solve that problem today, but I think that's a good place to start, is to look at what are the other state and federal agencies using, see where ours differ, and see what kind of improvements we could make.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the first subgroup this morning. I think if the subgroups can give us some feedback and direction with these recommendations, they don't have to solve all the problems or figure out what the definitions in this case would be, just that they recommend that we look at changes to them to either improve clarity or line them up with the federal definitions or whatever. So as we go through this process and the task force makes recommendations, anything that needs like a rule change or a statute change, of course, is going to go through that long public process. So a rule change, if the task force says we need to change a specific rule and recommends, sort of a direction, then we'll go into the rulemaking process. And I'm sure many of you will sit on the stakeholder groups that we have during the process. And that's when you really start talking about the words and specifics. So
Right.
Our hope on this is just to get direction. So if we go into like a rules package, we know what we need to change in general.
Great. Yes, thank you, Amy. Yeah, it's not our job necessarily to write the detailed changes, but to acknowledge that there's room for an update or improvement.
Well, is that I could use some clarification, because I mean, there's things that may be accomplished that the department can easily take over and do through rules making. But if it's a statutory definition, are we supposed to be providing a recommended solution to the legislature as well, so that they can act statutorily rather than the rulemaking process? And if that's the case, just generally, indicating it won't give the legislature, the notion that we are trying to fix.
It's a totally different process, and you're right, there's a totally different dynamic to it, but in some ways we handle it kind of similarly. So if a recommendation comes from the task force on legislative changes, what we'll do is get the administration's support, and then our legislative folks will look for a sponsor, and then we'll start talking about language with the sponsor. And then of course, a lot of times those bill sponsors will bring in stakeholders and get input, and then it goes through the committee hearing process and everything else. So I've never been in a situation where like a task force could make a suggestion and not have it totally changed by the time it goes through the legislature. But I think if you can give the concepts and then work with the department as we go through the process, I think, you know, we don't need to have the language right now. That can come after you recommend direction.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I want to go back to the sort of core recommendation here, the financial responsibility for operation and maintenance. I'm going to start with what is actually a separate recommendation that I want us to discuss, but they're linked in my mind, and that's why I want to do it. It's standard practice in utility regulation. And so this is what I'm going to say is really already being done for those dams in Michigan that are owned by regulated utilities. That when you have something like a dam that has an expected life and then will have removal costs, the annual revenue that the utility gets from its customers includes both the depreciation of the original investment and funds that are being accumulated for the ultimate removal. So I would like to take that same concept and apply it to all of these dams. And let's just say we're doing licenses for 50 years. So if a dam, if the estimated cost of removal is $5 million, at the beginning of that time, you know, we would require the dam owner to start to deposit, say, $100,000 a year into escrow or some other assured, you know, source of funds that would be available for the ultimate removal. And if you get 10 years in, you know, you have $1 million, and then you have 4 million yet to go, but now we have a revised estimate of the ultimate removal cost. Say it's $1 million more. It's still 5 million that has not been accrued. Then you recompute the depreciation at that point, and you know they continue to deposit into escrow, and I want to put quotes around that. So by the end of the license, the money is available for removal. I do want us to discuss that idea, but the point I want to make now is routine operations and maintenance. We could, you know, say that they've basically got to do it. But if there's some major maintenance that, you know, is needed, we could take the view that that can be withdrawn as a loan, if you will, from the escrow. And then that increases the amount that has to be paid in to the escrow on an ongoing basis for the balance of the life of the dam. So it creates a funding mechanism for the extraordinary expenses, much like the reserves that are typically accumulated in a condominium association, you know, against expected future maintenance or things like that. So just an idea to consider, but I'm thinking that for purposes of both removal and extraordinary maintenance expenditures, there ought to be an ongoing commitment of funds sequestered and protected from being used by the owner for other reasons to cover those two things.
Thanks, Doug. I think that's maybe a little bit related to what Amy just spoke to, and that's, you know, how deep a dive, you know, we can go into here. And is it up to this group to develop the architecture for a, you know, a funding scenario like you suggest, Doug? I think it's an excellent point. And I think we've captured it, but I guess, again, I just wonder how much time we can actually spend on working through those details.
So I'm going to be, I'm not drawing a line here, but I'm going to be very reluctant to put forward recommendations that aren't pretty concrete on this point of how we achieve financial responsibility. Not overly prescriptive, but we need to put real concepts on the table, not just say they ought to be financially responsible.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's hear from some of the others.
Well, I was just gonna say, yeah, what the way that recommendation is written, you know, you can read it 5 or 6 different ways. We talk about require owners of high and significant hazard dams to provide proof of financial responsibility or security to ensure the continued safe operation and maintenance of their dam. And then we go, this would also ensure that funding is available for the DSP to mitigate any hazard presented during a dam incident or emergency should the owner fail to do so. It seems to me that the first responsibility ought to be on the owner. And I'm not sure that's clear, that we want to ensure that funding is available for the dam safety program. Are we talking about public funds? It just seems to me that the owner ought to be the first one responsible. And that means, in my mind, some level of a financial insurance to deal with emergencies. And as Douglas pointed out, some demonstration that you have the funds to remove the dam should you decide to do so sometime in the future. Why should the public pay for that?
Because you have a recalcitrant owner, perhaps like Boyce, right? Or
well, but what we should be talking about is how do we prevent that from happening again?
Sure. No, I understand that, Bill.
Yeah, my point really is, you know, FERC was asking Boyce to fix it. And I don't want to get too much into the details of that, but they were saying they didn't have the funds or failing to come up with them. And I'm saying from the time that they had that license, they should have been making regular deposits into some financial account and accumulating those funds. So the question of them having funds when ordered to do something should never have come up, because there should have been funds accumulating from the beginning. And if they can't meet that obligation, then we either have a way through tax assessment or something of making sure that they make those contributions, or they lose ownership, right? That's really what I'm coming to.
Yeah, I hear you, Douglas, and I'm agreeing with you. I think we don't have to get in. I'm trying to avoid the specifics of how do we, what the escrow account can be used for and all those things. I'm just saying what we ought to be saying is that the dam owner is responsible for maintenance, for his for any potential breach that occurs during the time of his ownership, and removal of the dam when the dam has reached its useful life. And he ought to be financially responsible for that and should demonstrate that he or she has the capability to do that as part of the licensing procedure.
It sounds like we're all kind of agreeing to the same thing here. I see heads nodding. Any other comments here?
I have a comment, Mark.
Yes, please, Amy.
So this morning, because we have limited amount of time, we did a couple things that I think might be helpful for this group to think about. One of them was if we were all kind of on the same page, then someone from the subgroup volunteered to make any little tweaks to the language and send it out in an email before the next meeting to kind of have some back and forth on it. And then for ones where there seemed to be like some different opinions, or like people really wanted to dive into changing the recommendation, someone would volunteer to take the lead, and then those folks who were also interested would have a conversation to prepare us for the next meeting. And I think in some ways, we've barely made it through very many of the recommendations here. In some ways that might help move us forward, and it'll allow us at the next meeting to have some time to talk about sort of the broader picture things that I know you all want to talk about, like dam removals and other things that the ASDSO report doesn't really deal with, climate change. If we can maybe assign some of these to some folks to work on more before the next meeting, it might help us get through it.
Sure. Great. Thank you for that, Amy. I appreciate it. I think it's an excellent suggestion. Doug, I don't know, hearing that, if you might be willing, and I don't know if Brian or Bill, maybe the three of you would be interested in sort of noodling on some more specific language here for the group to consider.
Sure.
Doug, would you be willing to kind of take the lead on that, and with support from Bill and Brian?
Yeah, I'll work on it.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, moving on down here. Next recommendation is to require the inspection of construction by DSP staff. There was some questions about clarity being needed. Eagle responded there. I guess maybe this kind of relates to the next recommendation too, on a first filling plan, or perhaps they kind of can be collapsed here. I'm not sure, but I'd start off again with Luke, if there's anything else you want to add here, and we'll open it up.
Sure, just really quickly, I think that we have in the rules, you know, a condition whereas, you know, final approval doesn't happen until the DSP has gone out and done an inspection. So if we issue a permit under Part 315 for repair, construction, rehabilitation, reconstruction, whatever, we do have to do that final walkthrough inspection. But I don't think it's a requirement that the engineer has to be there, you know, so maybe that's kind of something, but this definitely comes into play for construction or reconstruction of dams, where it might be better to have some more teeth in that to ensure that the construction was done per permitted plans and specs, but also that there's somebody competent on site when they're actually filling the reservoir with water, because that's when a lot of problems can rear their head. So I don't think we have a whole lot of specificity on that in rules or statute. So I guess the thought would be, do we need specificity on this particular issue, or do we use our broad authority and just kind of make a procedure and permit conditions or whatever, you know, to address this specific issue? So I guess that's just kind of this and the next one with the same thing, right?
Yeah, that's what, before I open it up, Luke, I mean, it seems like the two are really kind of combined, or can be combined. Mm-hmm. Could they not?
I believe so. It would be the same process.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, unless there's any objections, we'll proceed in that manner. But let me open it up to hear. This seems like a pretty straightforward, sort of a slam dunk here.
Yeah, this is Douglas. I just have a question for Luke or anyone else. It seems to me that the principal options here are you administratively start writing it into the permit conditions, you do administrative rules, or we put it in law. Is Eagle concerned that there's any limitation of authority with writing it into standard permit conditions, or an ability to put it in administrative rules subject to that process?
So I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, there are very general provisions in the rules that say we can, you know, put in permit conditions we think are necessary to protect the safety of the dam. So maybe it's something where we have those folks who are more adept at, you know, thinking about where the holes exist in the statute, where the loopholes exist, where people could exploit those. Take a look and say, hey, you know, this is covered. We've got this scenario is covered. The other scenarios are covered, and the perceivable scenarios are covered under this broad authority. Or do we need to go out and start patching those holes where people could do what you suggest, Douglas, is we put in a condition in a permit and they say, you don't have any authority to enforce this condition. And so so that would be my recommendation, personal recommendation would be, okay, if we do anything other than this, where we think we would add to the rules or statute because it can't be handled in permit conditions, we would do it because we've identified loopholes that need to be, you know, closed out. So okay, like I said, I'm not a lawyer, so somebody else needs to make that determination.
I think that's just a matter, we need advice on that.
Okay. All right, others, anything else on this end? I think we've got what we need. I want to keep moving here.
Just, it's my understanding that you all do some inspection, but you don't have a lot of authority. This is something that would be desirable from the department's perspective to have the authority to, construction observation is the right term, by the way, just legally. Is that true, Luke? I mean, you guys do this fairly often, maybe not every single time, but it is something that, I mean, you own it when you've inspected it. That's the issue. I want to make sure that that's something the department's okay with. And I think Amy and I talked about this a bit, and that's true.
So it's a couple things, right? We do like pop out during construction as we have time, and you know that our time is pretty limited, so that's not as frequent as that could be or maybe should be. And we do have the ability and the authority to require a post-construction and final inspection, and that's after the design engineer has already certified the project. They've provided as-built plans, final engineering report, and a letter that says, I certify that this project was completed satisfactorily in compliance with, or in conformance with, you know, permitted plans and specs. So it's a little bit of a, you know, more of a just kind of a formality type review where we're not doing the in-depth, but I think that maybe, you know, if we had the staff and the time to be able to dig into these a little bit more, it might be better. But, you know, we're not building a whole lot of dams. So this issue of completely draining and then refilling or first filling on a new dam is a very infrequent one. So that's why I say is I don't know if it's already covered under our broad authority. We could just implement a policy that says we're going to do this from now on, or do we need something spelled out that says this is the way that you do this, you know, and this is what must be submitted, and this is what, you know, what the department will, how they will respond, type of thing.
Okay.
Luke, is that something you can go back and noodle on with your folks and maybe come back and give us a little additional guidance on the preference and sort of the legalese here?
Yep. And I think a lot of these we might just need to circle back to the ASDSO folks and say, what did you see that other states are doing better that we need to incorporate, right? Because maybe this hasn't really been an issue, but it could be an issue, or it was an issue somewhere else. So yeah, I think that I will think about it and also circle back with our colleagues at ASDSO to say, what are other folks doing? Where do you see that we need to improve? And then maybe I'll have some more specifics on examples for next time.
Okay, great. Thank you. I would like to keep us moving. We have about 20 minutes left. If you have any comments additional, go ahead and type them in and we'll have them captured. But I would like to keep moving here. The next one, the first time it's being discussed by the group, is to require periodic exercising of emergency action plans as discussed in the DSP. Well, it sounds like another recommendation.
I think that should be a condition of licensure, but as for the details of that, I think the emergency action folks ought to be making their recommendations first.
So we'll defer to that subgroup. It sounds like, Doug, is that the recommendation?
That's my recommendation, yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts, objections to that from members? Okay, thank you. Next one is to meet FEMA's Model Dam Safety Program recommendations for design floods. I know there are some differences in the numbers, 100, 200, 500 year storms, that kind of thing. I'm guessing that's what this pertains to. Luke, is there anything you want to start us off with?
Yeah, I think this is just kind of, you know, if you read the SDSO report and go to the appendices and maybe even look at the Model Dam Safety Act or whatever program, that, you know, we're probably a little behind the curve when it comes to other states in the nation and in the Midwest and what the federal recommendations are. The only thing I would say be cognizant of is with the recommendation to change, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion on how you implement that change, because it potentially puts a lot of dams who are currently in compliance then out of compliance, and there probably should be some strategy on how to deal with that. Not that we have to solve that today, but just, right. You know, it's the one shoe, it's the other shoe is going to drop too, you know. So
sure. Sure, thank you. Others, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, this is Douglas. For those of us who aren't right on top of this, in the federal model dam safety program, are those recommendations based on trended flood flows, or are they, more static?
So anything that has a return interval, like a 500-year or 100-year, that's going to be trending with the statistics, rainfall and runoff statistics for the area. Anything that's more like a PMF or half PMF, that's more of a theoretical methodology where it doesn't, it can be influenced by rainfall, like in Texas and South Carolina, where we had rainfalls that far exceeded what we thought PMF was, or PMP was, probable maximum precipitation. But that's more of a, here's what the methodology says the rainfall is. You develop a rainfall runoff model, and then here's what the resulting flows are. Those are more or less static unless they restudy it with a different methodology, a better, more up-to-date methodology. But the statistically derived ones from rainfall data are more, they can change over time more frequently, I would say.
Okay, I want us to be clear that we should be dealing with the trends, not a static view.
And that as I understand, that is the federal recommendations, right?
Federal recommendations for federal agencies usually deal with, for high and significant hazard potential dams, you're talking about half PMF and PMF, which is more of a static, but it's more of a theoretical maximum. So it's static, but it's kind of like the biggest we think that can happen. So, and typically you're not going to have any meaningful statistical data to inform that because we don't see floods that are that big. To build any confidence in statistics, you got to have a good data set, including very, very high flows, very, very low flows, and everything in between. So if you're talking about going to the highest flow that we've seen, extrapolating, well beyond that, the confidence in a statistically derived, value is very, very low. You can do things like that, but yeah, so yeah, I think the PMP is it's a very conservative number, but it is relatively static.
Doug, this is Mario Fusco. Just a question for you. When you mentioned something about trending, you were talking about forecasting due to climate change?
Yes. As well as reflecting whatever else, not just climate change. It can be land use change upstream as well.
Okay, thank you.
I have a comment too on this. I mean, it seems to make sense, like right off the bat, we should do that. I feel, though, a little obligated to say none of us know what those words mean beyond what Luke just explained. And I'm pretty sure many of us wouldn't even be able to understand it if we saw it, but it might be a good idea to share that information with us so we at least understand what that means. I feel like, though, there needs to be more than just that, and I think it touches on Doug's future scenario. I feel like there should be a recommendation that's something along the lines of, let's have a study group spend some time on that forecasting and what is in that design criteria. But in the meantime, let's just start with FEMA. I do have great concern about where rain might go in the future, not to require everybody to have spillways for the worst case imaginable, but to have some idea that when there is major construction or reconstruction done on a dam, that there is consideration of a reasonable range of possibilities for 50 years from now, and that the design considers that you might have to expand spillways in the future, doesn't expand them. But I just feel like there should be a study group that provides input and help find that over the next 2 or 3 years as to what should you do in future scenarios. I even have concerns just about looking at recent rainfall trends or the past 30 or 40 years and using that as the design base. Is that really the best? Obviously PMF, as I understand it, is going to be based on air temperature. That's going up, those two graphs look very similar, right? The temperature graph and the rainfall graph. Lots of chatter for 100 years, and then a zoom up outside of the chatter zone in the last 30 years. And that is a big concern for this particular piece of infrastructure. Sorry, long speech, but study group recommendation that I feel is separate from what we've got in front of us. Let's adopt what FEMA's doing right now and be thinking over the future.
Yeah, I'm not offended by the study group recommendation, but I do think there was an idea in what you said that probably warrants surfacing here for the regulatory scheme. The idea is that the conditions triggering, say, an order to create a spillway or to enlarge one is different than the design criteria for the spillway, given you're going to do it. And we should make clear that both of those ideas need to be available to the dam safety program, where they can say, as a matter of inspection, this dam is at risk because it's no longer got sufficient capacity for what's happening here.
Yeah. And
they also should be able to say, well, you're doing major maintenance, or you have to address this expectation of increased flood flow. The design criteria now are X.
Yeah. I think Doug's onto the highest risk factor in everything in all of our recommendations that we're ever going to come into. I can't imagine there's a dam that exists out there that isn't under designed for today's reality. And obviously we can't flip a switch and have everybody change it, but we do need to agree, like Doug says, on what is the right design as of today, even. So
I'll just close with one really quick thing, which is every time a dam safety inspection is completed, every 3, 4, or 5 years under current statute, or every time a permit application comes in for a modification to a dam, the design engineer or the consultant doing the report or the engineer doing the report is required to request from us an updated flow estimate for whatever the design flood is. If it's 100-year, the 200-year, or the half PMF, they have to confirm those numbers and show that their design meets those requirements. It doesn't go into any future forecasting. We don't run rainfall simulations that say what it might be in the future, but given today, and that's all based on past rainfall runoff data, whatever that design flood is determined to be, that's the minimum requirement on the date that the inspection is performed or the permit is considered. So there is some of that, but you're right, it's kind of retroactive based on old data. There's not much, we don't have any requirements for in what we'd call like climate resiliency or something like that, where you're thinking to the future what trends might be. I know that the folks down in Tennessee Valley Authority, that's part of their design process. They are thinking about future rainfall. They're running Monte Carlo methods or analysis and thinking about that and over designing, but we don't have any regulatory teeth currently to build any resiliency above today's design flow estimate.
Yeah. So, and I at least am saying I think that you need to be doing that, because what we don't need, what the dam owners don't need, is to do the maintenance based on one design flow and then in a few years be told there's another one. We need to give them a reasonable forecast of what they need to do through at least the end of the license, and let them make a choice between dam removal and making that investment.
Okay, I'd like to, if we could, close off the discussion here. I think it's been covered quite well. Suffice it to say, there's no objection to this. Obviously, there's some need to further look at the FEMA's current approach, but also incorporating some of these newer concepts that consider climate change and other variables. So I'd like to, if we can, we've got about 10 minutes, at least get through the list here so we can say we've made a second pass through half and a first pass through all. So indulge me here for just another 10 minutes. Next recommendation is to meet the MDSP recommendations for inspection frequency as discussed in another recommendation. Luke, can you just clarify this, or do we need to spend much time on this?
The recommendation, quite simply, is to go from like 3 years for highs to 1 year. I think it's 2 years for significance and 5 years is adequate for lows. I think that's what the model dam safety program. So instead of 3, 4, or 5 years, it'd be 1, 2, or 5 years.
Right, and I agree with that.
Okay.
Bill.
Okay, great. Let's move along here. The creation of a dedicated dam safety emergency fund. Obviously, this relates to the earlier discussion. Whose responsibility is it? Presumably, it should be the owners. And are public funds justified being spent on some of these things when need be? So,
I look at this. I look at this like RECRA. You're going to have a set of very responsible owners that will, if we go to a licensing program, will do what they're supposed to do. There are going to be some that just don't. And at the end of the day, you got to have an emergency fund somewhere. You got to have it to deal with those that don't.
Okay. And so, Bill, we did talk a little bit earlier about, what and how. I guess maybe you and the others, I don't think there'd be any objection to this recommendation, but again, sort of, is it realistic to think, well, it's not talking about general fund, but creating a fund that wouldn't revert. How to accomplish this?
How well you could do it in lame duck when they've got extra money and just create a fund. That'd be the easy way to do it. That'd be the easy way to do it.
And again, maybe it's not our job other than to endorse, me too.
There should be a fund. There should be a fund. I think that's what we need to say.
Okay.
One thing I would add to what Bill was saying is seed money to establish the fund and replenishment over time as we dip into it, right? That's
absolutely.
However, whatever the funding strategy is, and we'll leave that up to you guys, but just keep that in mind that it has to be replenished if it gets depleted.
Right.
Okay. Let's just end it for the time being and look at the next one. Considering substantial increases in program costs. Seek to work with ASDSO and the leadership to see if a system-wide simplification of this problem of information transfer can be developed and implemented. There's a lot in there, Luke. Can you kind of distill it down for us, what it all means?
I really think this is what we've been talking about all along, and Douglas has been touching on is, should we co-regulate FERC dams? Should we do something more than we do now, or are we okay with the current model? And I think, like I said, I can go back and get some examples of what other states are doing where they don't co-regulate, but they have something built in where they do receive the documentation and stuff outside of the FERC CEII FOIA request, which is very difficult to navigate. So I think that's basically just I think what they're trying to highlight this is a national issue. So they're encouraging us to work with ASDSO on it, who's already been talking about this on several fronts in several states. And, obviously the Oroville thing was a big catalyst for that. So it started ramped up in California. So,
okay. Thank you, Luke. Just any quick comments on that?
I think we will be dealing with this as we develop the other recommendations, except that there is a information exchange problem with FERC, as witnessed by what happened up in Midland. So, and that's what we're going to have to work on a national basis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. And finally, to provide for future inflation, the value of any fees, fines, penalties be established in the regulations with concurrence of Eagle oversight entity, kind of related to some of the other topics we've been discussing here. Luke, is there anything we need to talk about here? It's part of it sounds like the larger conversations we're talking about setting up funds and such.
I think that our fees and fines have not changed since the statute was implemented, and probably for some of these larger projects that we talked about, dam removals, dam construction, the fees might not be adequate, to even cover staff time. So I think that's just something that needs to be revisited, and they're making the point to keep revisiting them to adjust for inflation, over time, because they're set 30 years ago, that dollar amount is probably worth a lot less today. So
okay.
Well, it is worth a lot less, yeah.
Comments from group members on this one?
I support.
I support this.
Okay. Excellent. That brings us to about 4 minutes left before we close here. I apologize. We kind of went through that kind of fast, those last ones, but I think they presented an opportunity for us to do so. Is there anything that you've sort of had burning in your head that you want to share with the group before we wind down today? Anything specifically that maybe you don't see as captured on this document that we want to be prepared for at the next meeting?
One quick item that Evan sent out a little bit of a chat on a couple of points to bring in local government into the decisions about the into knowledge about a dam. The other piece of it that I'd like to see, little piece, is if you're buying a property. If you're buying a property where a dam exists, where you become the owner of the dam, that ought to be disclosed under the in a real estate transaction, just as you have to disclose if you have asbestos, just as you have to disclose, so that people know that if in buying that property, they become the owner and therefore responsible for that dam.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. Aaron, if you would be sure to capture that thought, well, both that one and the one that Evan mentioned about local involvement.
Yeah, I'll make sure to copy all the stuff out of the chat. I apologize that I wasn't able to respond to it during this meeting, but thank you all for for participating in that. And just a quick question before we all hop off. Thank you to Doug, Brian, and Bill who are going to work on those two funding pieces. This last one though, right here, the second one, does anyone want to take this to kind of discuss it before our next meeting? This requiring licenses and talking about
I suggest that we'll fold that in.
Oh, to the others. Okay. Thank you, Doug. And then Luke has just a couple things there noted. Yeah, just to kind of review related to ASDSO. So wonderful. Great work, team.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. I think that covers next steps.
Yep. And this will be sent out to everyone as well, obviously.
Okay. And then I'll be in touch, Aaron and myself, with those folks just to help provide any support and keep things moving along here. So that brings us to the close of this meeting. I really appreciate all your time. Excellent discussion. Very helpful. I hope you're all feeling pretty good about where this is headed. We do have one more meeting of the subgroup before the full task force meeting, and then obviously there'll be some separate conversations among group members. So just one final pause here for any parting shots or comments from group members before we adjourn. Okay, great. Again, thank you all so much for your time, and we'll be in touch. All right. Thank you. So long.
Take care.